You ever think about what happens when there's a real person on the end of that gun?
The thing that haunts me are all the guys that I couldn't save. There's a war going on. There's people dying. We're protecting more than just this dirt.
Your dad, he's a hero.
You did your part. You let somebody else go.
I'm willing to meet my creator and ask for every shot that I took.
Chris was a tiny boy at the time, and he had come hunting with his father. He then fired a shot, killing a deer. In his enthusiasm, he tossed his gun down and rushed in search of the prey. When Chris's father notices this, he becomes enraged and instructs his son to always respect his weapons. Days begin to pass like way, and after years, Chris has become a cowboy. When Chris returns home from work one day, he finds that his girlfriend is having an intimate relationship with someone else, and this utterly breaks his heart. He kicks his girlfriend out of the home and uses wine bottles to forget his sorrow. Then a news comes on TV in which it is told that Al-Qaeda terrorists have attacked the US Embassy and many people have lost their lives in this attack. Chris is now quite saddened by all of this, and God alone knows where the idea of becoming a soldier originated. He determines that he will become a decent American soldier and serve his nation. After a few days, Chris attends the Army interview and, fortunately, is picked, and his training begins the next day. During this training, he must complete a variety of exercises that help a soldier become mentally and physically healthy. However, finishing this training was not for everyone, and many individuals dropped out in the middle, but Chris persevered to the conclusion. During the training, Chris Sr. is quite pleased with his shooting ability and boosts his sniper training so that Chris can become a good sniper. After many months of training and hard work, Chris was now ready to enter the battlefield. Along with Chris, many other people finished this training, and all of them will shortly be going to war. Chris and his buddies head to a pub to celebrate their happiness. Here is Chris. Chris comes upon a girl named Taya. Chris and Taya love each other's company, and the next day they begin spending a lot of time together. Their friendship quickly leads to love, and they become intimate. One day, Chris watches the news and learns that the 9/11 assault was carried out by a terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda. After a few days, Chris and Taya married each other. On the day of his wedding, Chris got the news that he has to join the war in Iraq with his team because the most wanted terrorists of Al-Qaeda are hiding in Iraq. Chris is overjoyed to learn that he has also been involved in the conflict. Chris left for Iraq after his marriage, and this was his first tour there. Chris arrives in Iraq and is seen in the air due to his sniper skills. However, Chris is not the only sharpshooter in this fight. Someone else is yearning for US soldiers' blood. One of Chris's buddies informs him that among the militants of Al-Qaeda, there is a lethal sniper who kills his target from a distance of 500 yards. The name of that sniper is Mustafa. The next day, Chris resumes his post and begins providing cover to his colleagues. Then his eyes go to a car which was moving towards his team at a high speed. Here Chris again showed his magic and gave a headshot to the driver of the car, and the car stopped in time, and as soon as it stopped, there was a huge explosion, and once again Chris saved the lives of many soldiers. That day, he killed 2 additional terrorists who attempted to assault US forces. Now, that evening, we find Mustafa, Al-Qaeda sniper, seated in his position. When a US soldier approached his target, he shot him in the head as soon as he had the opportunity. Chris had been in Iraq for 3 days, and he had killed 8 terrorists during that time. Chris's co-workers were impressed by his abilities, and they immediately nicknamed him the Legend. Days pass, and Chris receives a call from Taya, revealing that she is now pregnant. According to Chris's senior, Zarqawi is the commander of Al-Qaeda and was responsible for the attacks in America. Following this, he goes home, and Taya arrives to pick him up from the airport. Chris had come home, but his thoughts were still on the battlefield. He remained immersed in his thoughts all day and kept watching war news on TV. One day, Taya's stomach pains suddenly increased, so they immediately rushed to the hospital, and here Taya gave birth to a boy. Days pass, and Chris's second Iraq deployment begins. When Chris arrived in Iraq, He was informed that he had been elevated due to his abilities, and he is now an army chief. He establishes a squad and resumes his quest for Zarqawi. They accelerate their quest. During this, they enter a house where they find a family. They ask the head of the family about Zarqawi, but this man says that he does not know anything about Zarqawi. Chris's crew chooses to hide in this house and monitor the movements around them. Their luck has changed as they observe Zarqawi enter a building. Chris's squad is now sitting in ambush, ready to assassinate Zarqawi as soon as he exits the building. While these discussions are going on, the owner of this property approaches all of them and invites them to supper. He informs them that today there is a feast at our place, and that we never eat alone. Chris's crew likewise agrees, and they all sit down and begin eating. Chris then focuses his gaze on the man's badly injured elbow. This is the condition of elbows when someone sits on it for hours, like while sniping. Chris suspects this man, so he sneaks out of there and starts searching the whole house, and during this he finds a whole store of weapons in a secret chamber. He instantly approaches this individual, apprehends him, and leads him to a corner, where, after several threats, this man eventually opens his lips. He informs everyone that Zarqawi is hidden in the building in front, and he recognizes me. Chris's squad now takes their position and dispatches this man to Zarqawi. This man cautiously moves towards the home, knocks on the door, and as soon as the door opens, Chris's squad begins firing furiously. Now the gunfire has begun. When Zarqawi hears the voice, he gets attentive and comes out of the home through a tunnel, seats in a car, and begins running away, but before he can run away from there, Chris's team fired bullets at his car, and then there was an explosion and Zarqawi was killed in this explosion. Meanwhile, Mustafa also gets the news of Zarqa's death, and he also becomes furious with anger, and now he decides that now he will kill every man of Chris's team one by one. Chris's second tour is now complete, and he has come home, but the war has settled in his mind, and he is having difficulty adjusting to normal life. Days pass like this, and Taya gives birth to a girl. When Chris is in the hospital, he notices that his daughter is wailing loudly and begins shouting at the nursing nurse. Now Chris is when Taya notices such conduct. She becomes concerned about him and informs Chris that he has completely changed. You may be with me, but your thoughts are still on the battlefield. However, Chris pays little regard to Taya's remarks, and his third tour begins in the coming days. Chris reaches Iraq, and he feels very good spending time with his friends. Now one day Chris is out on patrolling with his team. All of them are laughing and joking among themselves and pulling each other's leg. Then we see Mustafa, who was seated in his position, enraged and determined to get revenge for Jarka's death at all costs. Then he spots Chris' car and shoots a bullet, which strikes the driver. Everyone was wearing bulletproof vests, therefore everyone's lives were saved. But Chris is now absolutely bewildered. He gets out of the automobile and walks to the roof of a building with one of his pals in order to travel to Iraq. Chris could locate Mustafa's whereabouts. Chris and his buddy, Beagles, were discussing when Mustafa fired another shot, which struck Beagles. Chris tried to determine his whereabouts, but it was of no use, so he immediately came down with Beagles and everyone took him to the base. Now seeing this condition of Beagles, Chris and all his companions became furious, and they all immediately went in search of Mustafa, but doing so was their biggest mistake because Mustafa was still sitting at his position, and now Chris's entire team was on his target. Mustafa killed another of Chris's companions, Mark. Chris was devastated to see Mark die because they had been buddies since training camp. Chris's third trip was cut short due to the worsening scenario. Chris came home to attend Mark's funeral. Then he went to the hospital to meet Beagle, promising him that he would murder Mustafa. When he was with Taya one night, he began saying bizarre things to her, as if he meant to tell her that he, too, would die like his buddies had. Hearing all of this, Taya becomes terrified and begins screaming aloud. She informs Chris that you should quit the army straight away. On this, Chris says that I cannot do this because only when I am there, all my comrades can move freely, and if I am not there, Mustafa will kill everyone one by one. Taya informs him that if he returns to the battle, he may not find us there. After a few days, Chris's fourth tour in Iraq begins. During this, he learns that Beagle was murdered during his operation. Chris becomes really worried after hearing this. He is terribly upset since Beagles were his greatest buddy. After a while, Chris's senior has a conference with everyone and informs them that our engineers are creating a wall in the middle of the city, which would assist us a lot in the fight. But there is a sniper in that region who is murdering our men, and it has been claimed that this shooter is none other than Mustafa. Now, on hearing Mustafa's name, Chris's whole team sets out to kill him. They reach the location and Chris takes aim and sits down. Then we see Mustafa and he is also sitting in his position. Then he shoots a bullet which strikes a US soldier. Chris now hears the gunfire and eventually determines Mustafa's location, but he is 2,000 yards away, or 1.8 kilometers. To put it simply, Chris and Mustafa are separated by a distance. 21. The football field was so far away that it was difficult to take a shot from there. Here Chris tells everyone that Mustafa is my target and he is about 2 kilometers away from here. When they hear this, everyone bans Chris from shooting this shot because the chances of it hitting were virtually non-existent. Furthermore, all of these people were surrounded by Al-Qaeda militants, and if Chris shot, they would learn their location. Seeing all of this, Chris Sr. quickly dispatches a backup squad and instructs Chris not to shoot. But Chris was possessed by a demon and had to kill Mustafa at any costs. Chris now does something that no average sharpshooter could do. He takes aim and shoots. His gunshot pierces the air and travels 2,000 yards, striking Mustafa immediately. The headshot was great. Everyone is stunned to witness this, and no one believes their eyes. But the bad thing is that the terrorists have also found out their location and they are also coming towards them in large numbers. With the situation developing, Chris' superior authorizes an airstrike, and the US Army begins dropping bombs from helicopters. Although Chris's squad may possibly be killed in this attack, they had no other alternative. Chris becomes terrified as he witnesses all of this and believes he is in danger. He believes he will not live any longer, so he contacts his uncle and informs him that he is ready to return home. Chris' luck turns out to be on his side here, as at the same moment, a sandstorm begins, making it impossible for anybody to see anything, and Chris's crew takes advantage of this chance. This was Chris Kyle's final assignment. After this, Chris left the army and returned home, but this war had a very bad effect on his mind. Even after coming home, his mind was lost in the battlefield. Being a sharpshooter, he began to notice even the slightest details. One day, Chris is sitting with his uncle in Pakistan, while his son is playing with a dog. Chris believes the dog is going to bite his son, but he is only playing with it. Chris had caught hold of the dog and is ready to murder it when his uncle calls out and stops him. Chris seeks medical attention due to his worsening health. The doctor informs Chris that word has spread around the community that you have killed more than 200 people. Do you regret this? Chris responds, "No, I do not regret this because if I hadn't killed them, they would have killed my brothers." Here's the doctor asks him whether he still wants to help people. Chris says yes. After this, the doctor brings him to a hall where there are many injured soldiers and Chris feels very good after talking to them. Days kept passing like this, and Chris gradually began to feel normal. He would spend time with his family and go hunting with his kid. One day, a guy approaches Chris and announces himself as a military, telling him that he needs Chris's assistance. Chris then sits in his car and follows him. At the end of the film, we discover that Chris is a soldier. It is said that this individual murdered Chris Kyle that day. Finally, we see some true moments from after Chris' death, when people from all across America took to the streets to commemorate him. This wonderful movie ends here. How did you like this movie? Do tell us by commenting. If you liked it, then like and share it and subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon.